Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. Psalm 62, verse 1 says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From Him comes my salvation." Maybe you've never noticed an unusual detail about the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. It's a fascinating story where an Ethiopian eunuch has come to Jerusalem to worship God, but because he was a eunuch, he was disfigured and not allowed into the temple. There were barriers to his ability to worship God. When Philip encountered him, the eunuch was on his way back toward Ethiopia and riding in a chariot. As he rode, he was reading from Isaiah, and Philip ran alongside his chariot and asked if the eunuch understood what he was reading. The story ends by Philip explaining how what he was reading applied to Jesus, and finally the eunuch asked what barriers were in the way of him being baptized. There were none, and he was baptized. Now that's a fascinating story in and of itself. So what's the unusual detail? Well, in those days, not everyone could read. So it was common that if you could read at all, you read aloud so others could hear and benefit from what you were reading. So even though the eunuch was riding alone in his chariot, he was reading aloud. That's how Philip heard him. Reading aloud was an important part of the culture then. Last week and this week, in the midst of Advent, we are looking at Bible stories about waiting, and in particular about waiting for God to act. It's a hard thing to do because we tend to think we know what is good for us and when it should happen, and waiting for God to act how and when God thinks it is right is hard. Last week we focused on folks who didn't do so well at that. They didn't wait for God and listened, and instead they rushed ahead with their own plans. This week we will look at those who trusted God during their waiting. And we begin with Hannah. And the first thing to say about Hannah is, don't bring your 3-year-olds to church and plan to leave them with me. I'll explain that later. Hannah was married to a man named Elkanah, and they were faithful and devout. Every year they would make the trip to the worship center at Shiloh and make sacrifices before returning home. That's how things were done then. But Elkanah and Hannah were childless. In that day, a woman's purpose was to bear children. So while they both wanted children, Hannah was particularly distraught. So one year when they went to Shiloh, Hannah entered the worship area and began to pray from her heart. In fact, she was so deeply moved in prayer that her lips moved, but no sound came out. Well, as we have already seen with the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, reading and speaking silently was highly unusual. And about that time, the priest, a man named Eli, happened by and saw her. He thought she was drunk. It was the only explanation he had for this odd behavior, and he began to berate her and send her out. That's when Hannah told him that she wasn't drunk, that she had been praying deeply and earnestly for a child. Well, Eli then blessed her and added his prayers that she would bear a child as well. Sure enough, about a year later, Samuel was born. The thing is, part of Hannah's prayer was that if God would grant her a male child, she would dedicate that child to God in God's service. So when he was weaned, at about 3 years old, Hannah brought him back to Shiloh and left him there with the priest Eli. Samuel was raised by the priest and lived in the worship center seeing his mother and father every year when they came to make sacrifices. And here's where we get to our theme for the week. Hannah had waited years for a child, and then after Eli blessed her, there was still more waiting. Waiting to get pregnant, waiting for the child to be born. What profound gratitude she had to give God's gift to her back to God. Hannah prayed and then left the matter in God's hands. That's trust. And then she trusted God with her precious gift. In her waiting, she held to her faith. Perhaps Psalm 59 verse 9 reminds us of Hannah's kind of faith. O my strength, I will watch for you. For you, O God, are my fortress. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.